Welcome everybody for joining us today on the Media of Things. We put this on through Media Savvy Citizens. We work towards just demystifying the media, and also because we work with teachers, we brought somebody special today, and we want to have somebody here talk about the future of learning. Now, obviously, learning involves media and technology, so that's the connection. I'm making it for you. So today we have Justin Reich. Is that how you say your last name? Yes. Yep. Okay. He's the director of MIT's Teaching Systems Lab. So the MIT Teaching Systems Lab. I actually don't know much about the Teaching Systems Lab, and I'm curious. Hi, thank you for joining us. And if you could tell us, what is the Teaching Systems Lab?
Sure. Well, thanks so much for having me. All around the world, people want to see more ambitious teaching and learning in classrooms. They want to see less recitation, fewer dull worksheets, more active, engaged, student-centered learning. And the only way that'll happen is if we can dramatically increase both the quality and the quantity of learning experiences that teachers have throughout their careers. So that's the Teaching Systems Lab. Our mission is to design, implement, and research the future of teacher learning. There are two big domains that we work in. One is we're really interested in online learning. Teachers lead busy and complex lives, and we want to be able to find better ways for them to have rich learning experiences online, especially with really complex topics that we think people might intuitively think would be really hard to do online. So we have a course that we're running right now on edX called Becoming a More Equitable Educator, Mindsets and Practices, that I teach with Rich Milner from Vanderbilt University. And then the second thing we're really interested in is when teachers learn, we think they have insufficient opportunities to practice. So when teachers learn, they listen to people talk about teaching, they talk with each other about teaching, but they very rarely do teaching. It's like if you went to, football players and said, well, you can watch game film and talk about it, but you can't try those plays, until you're going against the Patriots next week. And football players would say, that's stupid. We need a practice field. We need a low stakes but authentic place to do repeated, targeted kinds of practice to improve our skills, or we're not going to be able to get good at them. And we think the same is true for teachers. And so we try to generate practice spaces, learning environments inspired by games and simulations where teachers can rehearse for and reflect on important decisions in teaching.
Super cool, super awesome. And we appreciate the work that you're doing. And, it sounds like there's research, there's hands-on, and there's a time to play and a time to explore. And your research and your information we get to learn from. So thanks for your work. I know that I actually saw on the internet, on Twitter, that you had posted MIT through the Teaching Systems Lab, and you, along with a team of people, put together a report called What's Lost, What's Left, What's Next. And so I want you to talk a little bit about that research. I saw that you interviewed 40 teachers across the nation of all different, I think elementary through high school,
math, science, language, social studies, arts, music, physical education, public, private, charter, north, south, east, west. We managed to grab sort of 40 teachers from all over. This was back in March and April of last year. And we said, just what are the experiences that you're having? I guess we did it in April and May of last year. What are the experiences that you're having trying to do emergency pandemic teaching? And they told us, three things that really stood out across these 40 interviews. One was just the real challenges of managing student motivation in online learning. And there's actually a whole bunch of other research along those lines. There's so much of what keeps us learning in physical spaces, the connections that we have to each other and to our teachers. As one principal said, we're learning that there's 1,000 things that we do in classrooms every day, spoken and unspoken, to sort of help guide the learning process. And lots of them don't work over Zoom. So particularly last spring, when people felt thrust into this new remote learning world, that was one big feeling. That those challenges with student motivation got really connected to a sense of professional loss and burnout. Teachers use words like mourning, to describe how the plans that they had for the spring had to be put on hold or fell apart. Teachers who are master teachers with 10, 15, 20 years of experience said they felt like first year teachers again. I think some teachers today still feel like they're first year teachers again every day, trying to relearn, and for all those schools now that are shifting from fully online to some kind of hybrid practice, a bunch of these feelings just come back again, like, okay, this is brand new again. How do I do this? And it's different than other professions. We don't pay teachers particularly well. A big part of the compensation is the psychological reward of connecting with kids, and having a sense of competence and connection to your craft and connection to your discipline. And a lot of that was lost. And then, many teachers go into this work because they see schools as places where we can create opportunities for all kinds of kids from all kinds of different backgrounds. And I think for all teachers, but particularly for teachers who go into the work with that orientation, there was just this, dramatic exacerbation of inequalities that happened, that there were some kids, the kids who always had more resources were the ones who could get computers, who could go home to places with internet connections, who had quiet places to work, who had a mom or a dad, usually a mom, who could stay home and help them. And then there are lots of kids who were disadvantaged in various ways before the pandemic who didn't have access to all those resources. And those were the same kids who are most likely to have family members losing their jobs, to know people in their family or in their networks who died or got really ill from the coronavirus, to have more tenuous access to healthcare and things like that. So if you're in this work to try to build a more equitable society and you're watching a pandemic, dramatically exacerbate those already existing chasms, it's just a hard set of feelings. So we were trying to do this writing over the course of last year. Part of what ended up coming out of it was just teachers being like, oh, I feel heard. That sounds like my experience. You are writing about me. A lot of my work over the last year has been explaining to teachers that, some of the terrible things they feel are widely felt by other folks, and some of the things they can't fix are really unfixable. We just don't know how to fix some of these things. And so if it feels hard and impossible, that's kind of normal, because we're trying to do something that's hard and impossible. And that's not helpful in a constructive kind of way, but it does seem like a kind of thing that sometimes teachers value. But then we're also trying to communicate to school leaders, to administrators, to policymakers. Part of the work of management is managing the psychological health, the psychological safety of the people in our communities. And if teachers feel bad, anytime employees in an organization feel bad, it's a problem, but it's a particular problem with teaching. No disrespect to grocery store clerks, but you can be a grocery store clerk and have a pretty bad day, and feel really rotten, and you can still ring up customers, and put their groceries in bags. It's not the same being a teacher. If what we want to do is ask teachers to make human connections with their students, it's hard to do that when your bucket feels empty. So we're trying to tell those stories to help people think about them. Our goal now is to go back to those 40 teachers, and interview them again in the weeks ahead, and to learn more about how this year went, and what they learned from this experience, what they want to carry forward, and what they hope schools will leave behind as we figure out whatever the new normal is.
Yes, and we've heard, from many teachers, for sure, about some of those challenges and what they are going through. In fact, just yesterday, I had, was speaking to a teacher who says, I'm still working 12-hour days. There's so much information out there right now that I want to hear and listen to and be part of, but I can't, because I have to meet with my kids after school and, into the night, that they're coaching and working with their students. Now, this is a very, I think a lot of teachers are dedicated like this, right? Like, this isn't like one of those, like, oh, this is so different, like that. I hear that very often from teachers, that they're just overworking at this moment. And so I'm curious.
The only reason pandemic learning worked is because teachers doubled their work hours with no additional, I don't know if they doubled it, but they substantially expanded their work hours with no additional compensation. I'll say this too. I talked to tons of teachers, tons of administrators, and there's never been someone who volunteered for me. Oh, you know, what's kind of hard about this work is that there's this clump of teachers over here, which is just skating by. There's a group of folks that are just like kind of phoning it in. I've never heard, I talked to lots and lots of people. I'm sure there are folks that are out there like that, but it doesn't appear like there are educators who are sort of using the pandemic as an opportunity to goof off. I mean, it just seems like enormously more work for everyone.
Yeah, so there is a big learning curve for people. And so now, I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about the future of learning. Like, what are the things that you see going to be the predictions from your entity and from other places of what does the future of learning look like? We know what it looks like for the rest of this year, which is hybrid, for most in the United States. But what about next year? And what are some of the things that are being predicted?
Yeah, I think the core paradox of this year is that educators, teachers, school systems completely reinvented schooling, but in a weird way, they completely reinvented schooling to be kind of a facsimile of what we had before. We primarily use two technologies, video conferencing and learning management systems, things like Google Classroom and Canvas and things like that. We, for the most part, replicated a synchronous day with a certain number of class periods and times and things like that. And, much of what we've tried to do is maintain a whole bunch of the same routines as we've had before. If you had interviewed lots of instructional designers who know a bunch about online learning, they would not have described that as the optimal response. They would have said, look, if we're going to move learning to a whole new environment, let's embrace a whole different set of practices. So on the one hand, it was this total transformation. On the other hand, it was this, profound statement, profound revelation about the incredible conservatism of educational systems. And to describe that conservatism is not to make a moral judgment about it. It's just say, look, if you want to know what the future of education looks like, imagine at the pandemic, you said, we're going to be stuck in a pandemic for a year. What's school going to look like? It turns out the correct answer was, imagine teachers and school systems trying to replicate in-person school as closely as possible using online tools. And that would have been roughly the right answer. What does the future beyond this look like? It looks like us largely snapping back to what we were doing before. There are very, very few major structural change. One way you could describe what happened in secondary schools and colleges is that teachers walked away from their lecterns. They sat down in front of their home office webcams and they kept teaching roughly as they were doing before. It was, sort of an enormous amount of work to kind of recreate it. But at the same time, there's a lot of commonality in there. I think people are going to be very excited where they have not yet been back to classrooms to get everyone back to classrooms. I think there's going to be a whole bunch of practices that we took for granted in in-person schools that we're really going to value and celebrate in new kinds of ways. I think there's some ways that online, that sort of digital tools are going to wind their way back into classrooms, but we're not going to persist with hybrid learning models. The vast majority of students don't want to go back to remote learning. People are going to go back and teach, and their Google Classroom pages are going to be a little bit better, and they're going to use, Desmos or Jamboard a little bit more, but it's going to look like the schools that we were familiar with. A couple of things I hope will change. I think we found that who knows exactly what the right number is, but something like 10% of students, maybe a little more in high school, a little less in elementary school, discovered they really liked remote learning. And we may need to, in our country right now, the full-time virtual schools we have are really bad. They have really bad learning experiences for most kids and provide really bad outcomes. So if we want so if people want remote learning, we have to figure out how to do it well. Second, I would say is that I think there is a growing collective sense that one of the things that schools, that teachers, even crazy things like state offices of education have done much more of this year is recognize the humanity of students and people in schools. And I think some of that is going to have to be brought back into next year. I'm not quite sure exactly what that's going to look like. some of it in places people use language like trauma-informed care. The sort of twin pandemic of last year was anti-Black racism, now anti-Asian racism, with the George Floyd murders, with the terrible crime in Atlanta and so forth. And I think schools are going to have more of a reckoning to do with that. One thing that I'm talking about a ton with teachers and students right now, as they think about next year, kids will say things like, a big difference in this year is that I have a snack whenever I want to. We spend so much time in school policing young people's bodies. And for the last year, if a kid was hungry, they just ate. And if they needed to go to the bathroom, they just got up and went. How are we going to bring those kids back into environments and we're policing all of these activities in the same ways? I think there's a reckoning that we may come to there. Another thing I've been thinking about is, and talking with people about is, one great thing about schools, and a thing that was very painful to lose, is that when we bring everyone into schools, they're at a kind of equal place. One principal said, like, it used to be that we had 258 kids in one shared learning environment, and now we're trying to serve kids in 258 learning environments. But I think one thing that some educators discovered this year is when they had to go, into students' homes, they realized that students were not all starting from the same place. When you get them all kind of lined up in rows in your classroom, it feels like, okay, well, let's all start on this page and do all this stuff together now at the same time, because now we're all here in this equalizing space. But when you reach out into kids' homes, you're like, oh, you are all in very different places. And in fact, here, I've got to build my instruction that kind of recognizes the different places that you're at, and help you all move forward from there. So I think that's part, all the things I'm talking about are connected to this theme of, so much of education reform over the last 2 decades has been about, optimizing young people's performance on standardized tests. And the pandemic has forced us to quit doing that to some extent for at least a year. And to really think about, what is the humanizing work in schools? So I think that'll be a big theme in the year ahead.
Well, and that seems like a good silver lining, right? We have a lot to reflect on, and, thinking about humanizing, especially as we move with technology, right? Especially as AI comes into our schools, especially, as we know it's going to happen. And so I see there in the background that you have, and I think this is a good
new book
segue, a new book there, Why Technology Alone Can't Transform Education, by yours truly.
So I think if people wanted to understand how we got here, I did the final copy edits for the book around March 20th of last year. So right as schools were shutting down. And the book tries to explain the recent history of education technology. And there is this story for the last 20 years that new technologies are coming. They're going to come and sweep away the past. They're going to dramatically transform educational systems. And as we've just been talking about, educational systems were hobbled by the pandemic. It's not that sort of new ed tech tools needed to be better than the existing system. They need to be better than the sort of broken, mostly closed system that they had. And I just don't know of places, United States schools or districts, where new technologies had a really transformative effect on how we do teaching and learning. We took some of the oldest technologies we had, learning management systems from the 90s and 2000s, video conferencing. Video conferencing, when it was introduced in the 1930s, was called video telephony. It's one of the oldest signals technologies that we have. We turned to these old standbys. And to my knowledge, there's not a school or a district that you could go to and say, this is a place that has really figured out how to make remote online learning work well for lots of kids. Instead, what we saw is teachers kind of sanding down 1,000 rough edges. This little thing isn't working. I'm going to make this a little better. This piece is a little bit more motivating. Let's try to make that work. There's not like a new break, AI didn't come to save us. Virtual reality didn't come to save us. Massive open online courses, new media, they didn't come to save us. It was teachers doing an enormous amount of work, taking some really old tools and kind of making remote learning work. So, two stories of failure to disrupt is that every generation of education technologists, going back to Thomas Edison and film strips, has been telling us that new technologies are about to transform schools, and we should be very, very skeptical of those arguments. New technologies don't disrupt existing systems. New technologies get domesticated by existing systems. Existing systems go, oh, you like brand new thing, you fit here. And here is usually like pretty small. There's all kinds of work that's been done for 60 years with adaptive tutors. Advances in AI are going to make adaptive tutors slightly better. Basically, the only place where adaptive tutors work really well in school systems is in certain parts of math, maybe a little bit of computer science. That's going to be true for the foreseeable future. Now, that doesn't mean that adaptive tutors are a failure. In fact, I think lots of kids have really benefited this year from having a new subscription to Khan Academy or Dreambox or ST Math or whatever it is they're using. But also those things didn't transform reading or social studies or science. They probably didn't have a blockbuster transformation in your kids' experience learning math. It probably was the case that it helped them do kind of 20 minutes of fun, okay, learning stuff, especially on the days in which they couldn't connect with their teachers. And part of what failure to disrupt is all about is also celebrating those incremental advances. We don't make huge leaps forward in schooling and human development. It's not because people are stupid or the technology isn't good enough or teachers don't work hard enough. It's because it's hard. It's hard to build systems. In the United States, we're trying to build a system that helps 57 million school children be better versions of themselves every day. That's a hard task. And we should celebrate the tinkering and the incremental progress that we can make. And we shouldn't hold out hope for big sweeping changes because that's just not what's coming. The people who will be most satisfied with a career in education are ones who are, really excited to see continuous improvement and incremental change every day.
Wow. Well, thank you for writing the book. I can't wait to read it. And it sounds very inspiring. And part of that inspiration is really just leaving with the nugget, at least what I'm leaving with, which is it's about teaching, right? And it's about the teacher, and it's about how that teacher implements and uses maybe some technology, but technology is not going to change everything. And that's a narrative that, that we hear all the time, right? That use this tool, it'll change this, it'll change that, and this tool and that tool and this app and that platform. And I think teachers are feeling pretty overwhelmed, of I have this pressure to learn all these tools when they really should be just kind of taking a step back and figuring out what is it that I need my students to learn? How can I make it exciting? And is there some tool that I could use or some technology, to be, to better, to help assist in that, but it's not necessarily going to, like you said, AI is not going to change the student, right? And so that is very important because we go back to what we learned maybe also during the pandemic, which is connection and, the humanizing part and the connection, and that maybe we learn through human connection, right? And that these amazing teachers, what they provide for some students are that human connection and, and something that a piece of technology is just never going to be able to do, but is able to allow us today to have a conversation. And I'm appreciative of that.
Yes, absolutely. No, it's great to be able to be here. And thanks for sharing some of these stories with folks. And I think you're exactly right. Our technologies are only as powerful as the communities that guide their use. And so, that's a great theme for us to continue to carry forward as we think about connections with each other, connection with our colleagues, and then ultimately with our students and their families.
Oh, well, thank you so much for joining us. Do you have any parting words before we go? I appreciate your time.
I'm just enormously grateful, to all the educators in your audience. I really think that, my hat is off and my heart is with everybody who's trying to make it work this year. And I'm enormously grateful to wherever educators are for their work on behalf of their students and our communities.
Oh, thank you. Thanks so much for joining us. And I'll be sure to buy your book.
That sounds great. All right, Pamela.
All
Thanks so
right.
much. Thanks to
Thank
your
you.
audience. Take
All
care.
right. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye-bye.